Hello everyone, now let us discuss about anatomy of musculoskeletal system, skull. So skull is the bony framework of the head. It contains of 22 bones, not counting the bones of medulla. And the skull bones are majorly categorized into two types, cranial bones and facial bones. So total number of skull bones are 22. In that, it is comprised of 8 cranial bones and 14 facial bones. Now let us discuss about cranial bones. Now coming to cranial bones. Cranial bones form the cranial cavity which encloses and protects the brain. So on a whole there are 8 cranial bones. So what are those 8 cranial bones? Let us discuss here. The 8 cranial bones are 1 frontal bone, 2 parietal bones, 2 temporal bones, 1 occipital bone, 1 sphenoid bone and 1 ethmoid bone. Frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, sphenoid and ethmoid bones. Now let us discuss about each cranial bone. The first one is 1 frontal bone. It forms the forehead, roof of eye orbits or eye sockets, most of the anterior part of the cranial floor. Soon after birth, right and left sides of the frontal bone are united by metopic suture, which usually disappears between the age of 6 to 8. So there is 1 frontal bone and it forms the forehead, roof of eye orbits and most of the anterior part of the cranial floor. Then there are 2 parietal bones. They form the greater portion of sides and roof of the cranial cavity. Parietal bones, they form the greater portion of the sides and roof of the cranial cavity and they are 2 in number. The next are temporal bones. They form the inferior lateral aspects of cranium and part of cranial floor. They form the inferior lateral aspects of cranium and part of cranial floor. Next coming is occipital bone. There is 1 occipital bone. Occipit means back of head. As the name indicates, occipital bone, it forms the posterior part and most of the base of the cranium. Occipital bone forms the posterior part and most of the base of the cranium. The next is sphenoid bone. It has shape of the butterfly with outstretched wings. Sphenoid bone is a type of cranial bone and it has a shape of butterfly with outstretched wings. It lies in the middle part of the base of the skull. It articulates with all other bones, holding them together. This is important point. Sphenoid bone articulates with all other bones, holding them together. There is 1 sphenoid bone. Next is ethmoid bone. Ethmoid bone is a delicate bone located in the anterior part of the cranial floor, medial to the orbits and is sponge-like in appearance. It is anterior to sphenoid and posterior to nasal bones. It is the major superior supporting structure of nasal cavity. Ethmoid bone is the major superior supporting structure of nasal cavity and forms an extensive surface area in the nasal cavity. Number is 1. So in general there is 1 frontal bone, 2 parietal bones, 2 temporal bones, 1 occipital bone, 1 sphenoid bone and 1 ethmoid bone. Altogether there are 8 cranial bones. As we have discussed earlier, sphenoid bone, it articulates with all other bones. So it joins anteriorly with the frontal and the ethmoid bone. It joins laterally with the temporal bones and posteriorly with the occipital bone. Sphenoid bone is the major bone which joins with all other bones and holds them together. Now let us discuss about facial bones. Now coming to facial bones. There are 14 facial bones. 2 nasal bones, 2 maxillae, 2 zygomatic bones, 1 mandible, 2 lacrimal bones, 2 palatine bones, 2 inferior conchae and 1 vomer. Altogether 14 facial bones. Now let us discuss in detail about each facial bone. First we'll discuss about nasal bones. They are 2 in number. The paired nasal bones are small, flattened, rectangular shaped bones that form the bridge of the nose. They protect the upper entry to nasal cavity and provide attachment for some of the thin muscles of facial expression. The next are lacrimal bones. They are thin and roughly resemble a fingernail in size and shape. That is, they are the smallest. They have a size of fingernail. Lacrimal bones are thin and roughly resemble a fingernail in size and shape. They are two in number. They are the smallest bones of the face and are posterior and lateral to nasal bones. Lacrimal bones are the smallest bones and they are posterior and lateral to nasal bones. Smallest bones of face. Each lacrimal bone contains lacrimal fossa, a vertical tunnel formed with maxilla that houses the lacrimal sac that gathers the tears. The next are palatine bones. They are also two in number. They are L-shaped bones that form the posterior portion of hard palate, part of the roof and lateral walls of nasal cavity. Palatine bones, they are L-shaped and they form the posterior portion of hard palate and part of the roof and lateral walls of nasal cavity. The next are inferior nasal conchae. The two inferior nasal conchae are inferior to middle nasal conchae of ethmoid bone, are the separate bones not part of ethmoid bone. One important point is ethmoid bone also contains nasal conchae. They are superior and middle, whereas the inferior nasal conchae, which are inferior to the middle nasal conchae of the ethmoid bone, are separate bones and are not part of ethmoid bone. Inferior nasal conchae are not part of ethmoid bone. They form the inferior lateral wall of nasal cavity and project into nasal cavity. All three panes of nasal conchae, that is superior, middle and inferior, they increase the surface area of the nasal cavity and filter air before it enters the lungs. Although the superior nasal conchae of ethmoid bone are involved in the sense of smell. The superior nasal conchae of ethmoid bone are involved in the sense of smell. They are also two in number. So there are two nasal bones, two lacrimal bones, two palatine bones and two inferior conchae. Next coming is the vomer. It is roughly triangular bone. Vomer is roughly triangular bone on the floor of nasal cavity that articulates superiorly with the perpendicular plate of ethmoid bone and sphenoid bone and inferiorly with both maxillae and palatine bones along the midline. There is one vomer. It forms the inferior portion of bony nasal septum, the partition that divides the nasal cavity into right and left side. So what is the partition that divides the nasal cavity into right and left sides is the nasal septum. And vomer forms the inferior portion of the nasal septum. It is roughly triangular bone on the floor of the nasal cavity and it articulates superiorly with perpendicular plate of ethmoid bone and sphenoid bone and inferiorly with both maxillae and palatine bones. Now coming to maxillae, they are two in number. The paired maxillae unite to form the upper jaw. Both the maxillae, they unite to form upper jaw. They articulate with every part of the bone except mandible. That is lower jaw. The maxillae form part of floors of orbit, part of lateral walls and floor of the nasal cavity and most of the hard palate. Hard palate is the bony roof of the mouth and is formed by palatine processes of maxillae. Hard palate is the bony roof of the mouth and is formed by the palatine processes of maxillae and horizontal plates of palatine bones. Hard palate separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. The union and fusion of maxillary bones normally is completed before birth. If this fusion fails, that condition is called as cleft palate. Usually the union and fusion of maxillary bones is completed before birth. If this fusion fails, that condition is called as cleft palate. The next are zygomatic bones. They are two in number and they are commonly called as cheekbones. They form the prominence of cheek and part of the lateral wall and floor of each orbit. They articulate with frontal, maxilla, sphenoid and temporal bones. The next is the mandible or lower jaw. Two maxilla unite to form upper jaw, whereas mandible is the lower jaw. Mandible is the largest, strongest facial bone. The smallest facial bone are lacrimal bones, whereas the largest and the strongest facial bone and the only movable bone of skull is mandible. Mandible is the only movable bone of skull. It is the largest and the strongest facial bone. It is the only movable skull bone other than auditory ossicles, the small bones of ear. There is one mandible. So one vomer, two maxillae, two zygomatic bones and one mandible. Now coming to the diagrammatic representation. This is the parietal bone, occipital bone, frontal bone, sphenoid bone, ethmoid bone, nasal. This is the nasal bone and this is the lacrimal bone, smallest bone. Then this is maxilla, mandible. This is the largest and the strongest bone. This is zygomatic bone and this is temporal bone. This is the lateral view of disarticulated skull. Lateral view of disarticulated skull. By this we complete the skull, which includes cranial and facial bones. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for further videos on anatomy and physiology.